I am testing the microphone. It seems to work, Larry.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Larry Beckwith, and on behalf of Father Nathan Humphrey, I'm pleased to welcome you to St. Thomas's Church for the third event in our Lenten lecture recital series, celebrating the spirit of music in community. Before I introduce tonight's special guest, I want to speak a bit about the St. Thomas's Friends of Music initiative that is gaining momentum here in this beautiful sacred space on Huron Street. It was announced this past week that Elizabeth Anderson has been confirmed as the organist and director of music here, effective immediately, and that Manuel Piazza has been confirmed as the assistant director of music, effective July 1st. This is exciting news for the St. Thomas's music program and a bold new step in growing the musical life of the parish. We have lots of exciting plans that involve reinforcing the already wonderful music making that happens every week and developing new programs, especially centered around children and youth and community outreach and partnerships. To that end, the Friends of Music Committee, of which I am co-chair, along with the brilliant singer-songwriter Molly Johnson, the committee is ready to roll up our sleeves and do some dedicated fundraising to make sure these dreams can be realized. I hope you will stay in touch, contribute as you are able, and perhaps most importantly, spread the word about this series, our Sunday services, and other musical events happening in this beautiful and special space. And if you're interested in being involved as a donor, a volunteer, or in some other capacity, please be in touch either with me or with Father Humphrey or another member of the church. All are welcome. It is a great pleasure to introduce my close and dear friend Stephanie Martin, who is here tonight to lead the third lecture recital in our series. I've known Stephanie since we were both graduate students more than a few years ago at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Music. She is a probing and multi-talented musician who has spent her life nurturing a rich and creative sense of community wherever she goes. She's a harpsichordist, a pianist, an organist, a singer, a conductor, a musicologist, a teacher, a writer, and despite her many accomplishments in all of those areas, she is primarily known now as one of Canada's finest choral composers. She has held positions at Leaside United Church, Calvin Presbyterian Church, the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, Pax Christi Chorale, Scola Magdalena, and is associate professor at York University's School of the Arts, Media, Performance, and Design. Over the past decade, Stephanie has turned out a number of very fine, large-scale compositions, including an oratorio, The Sun, the Wind, and the Man with the Cloak, the opera Landovery Castle, about nurses who lost their lives in World War I aboard their Canadian hospital ship, Requiem for All Souls, and Missa Chicagoensis. Her choral symphony Babel premiered at Wilfrid Laurier University with Lee Willingham as conductor, celebrating the 40th anniversary of that Faculty of Music. Her new work, Water, an environmental oratorio, will be given its world premiere by the Grand Philharmonic Choir in Kitchener on May the 28th. We're going to hear Stephanie talk tonight, and we'll also hear some of her music sung by Julia Armstrong, Marianne Stewart, Suzanne Coltis, Crystal Saylor, Janet Nahabidian, Michael Rowland, Tom Leslie, Brian Martin, and yours truly. Stephanie has a long and close connection to this church, and we are so happy to have her here with us tonight. Please welcome Stephanie Martin.
Well, thank you so much, Larry. I feel like my talk is done now. You have rehearsed every piece of music I've ever written and all my jobs, so what's more to say? We can all go home now. But actually, I just want to thank Larry and Julia for all of the work that you have done to organize this evening and the series, and to Father Humphrey for his vision in this effort to revitalize music. And congratulations that you have appointed two fantastic musicians to work here. That's so important. So thank you just for giving me an opportunity to casually talk about my music tonight. I'm not speaking from notes, and in fact, as Larry spoke, some new ideas came into my head, so this will be improvised. I must say that at York University, I rarely lecture anymore. Learning is a much more communal experience these days at university. So if you are so moved to ask a question or sing along when requested in the program, please feel free. And I know that this is not a lecture hall. There's a certain feeling in this building which might make you feel reluctant to raise your hand, but I'm happy to answer questions. In fact, this is what the time is for me to talk about what these pieces have meant and how they got made. So I would like to talk about, to start with a specific piece of music. I think all of us along our life journey can pinpoint a certain time when things pivoted, and this piece would be part of that pivot for me. When I started as music director at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, a church with a long history where Healy Willen was music director for 40 years, I began conducting the choir there, and I was very earnest about it. And one day in March, not unlike a couple weeks ago, there was a huge snowstorm. And I had somehow gotten back from York to my house and realized there's just no way we can have a choir practice. And for any of the musical leaders in the audience today, you'll know that that is just crushingly devastating. To cancel a rehearsal is one of the most horrible things that can happen. So I thought to make it up to the choir, I would stay at home, snowbound, and write a motet for them. So I wrote Ave Verum Corpus, and it was a pivotal piece because it was the first piece that was really published by an established publisher and was disseminated and is sung in many places now. And we're going to sing it for you. I'd ask my singers to gather up front. And as they do that, I will remind myself to turn off my microphone so you don't hear the alto part very loudly over the chorus. Yes, I feel your hesitance to respond there. It doesn't seem right to applaud after singing a communion motet, but you know, that's okay. Tonight is an informal time of sharing. So, to organize my talk, I thought I would look at something I read by Benjamin Britten when I was a grad student back in school with Larry Beckwith. I read this amazing thing that Benjamin Britten wrote about the role of the composer in community. And I've drawn it on your handout there. He talked about the holy triangle of the composer, the performers, and the listeners. And when I saw that, I thought this is so brilliant, because I had been thinking about composers sort of out there in isolation, but he pointed out that you require people to interpret and perform that music, and you require people to listen to it to make it real. If a tree falls in the forest and all of that, referring back to Larry Beckwith's brilliant talk on Bruce Kerwin. So I thought that was a pretty brilliant thing, but now that I am older and I look back at that geometric shape, I realize that maybe it's not the perfect representation of what goes on in music making. It is an equal triangle, but invariably someone ends up at the top, and it's pyramid shaped. And that's maybe not the greatest way of thinking of music in the 21st century. So reflecting on Ave Verum Corpus, when you listen to that piece, class, what influences did you hear in that piece? I mean, I wrote it, I put the notes on the paper, but there's something else in the background happening. Chant. You heard the stepwise motion of chant? Good answer. Maybe you heard a little bit of Duraflay. I hope you did. Maybe you heard a little Healy Willen, or even some older models like Palestrina with those vocal lines. So I guess my point here is also borrowed from Ian Cousson, who talked last week. He talked about holding hands with his ancestors behind him. And composers don't just appear. Even if they have great musicians and listeners, they don't appear out of nowhere. We are very much created by our ancestors, our musical influences, our mentors, and our teachers. So I propose that we change that triangle, and we just add another corner and call it a square. And let's include all that music of the past that's informed us and held our hands as we create things for this century. So I would begin there, and I would also say if you're a doodler and you want to write some geometric shapes on the paper, I think it's a good way to engage with learning is to doodle on your page, and you might come up with your own model to represent how music is made. So that leaves us with a square. But then there's another really important element. If you are a composer who composes choral music, Andrew.
I think it's more about all 3 points rest on the basis of everything that's gone before, equally for the listeners as the composer.
So maybe it's a diamond, and here's the past.
Yes.
You might have to draw it out. Yes.
Triangle like this, not just a flat.
Right. Yeah, you can turn it around and look at it. I like that. I like that geometric model. So speaking of poetry, if you are a composer who writes mostly for choirs, you need an element of text in your compositions. And so I just like to tell the stories of a few pieces where poetry intersects with music making. So I noted them here. I talked about Snow. This was a piece that was commissioned by Exultate Chamber Singers, which is a group that has a long history here. And it was written for one of their singers who retired from the choir. So it was especially dedicated to her, Janice Kirkhamp, an alto in this choir for a long time. And Snow is the text by Archibald Lampman, who's a Canadian composer who I hadn't read a lot about, or read a lot of his poetry, excuse me. But that was delightful to learn about that. Confederation of Poets, as they are called. 17 Voices in Ottawa commissioned a piece for choir and solo cello, which is a kind of a different texture. So I was looking for the right poem for that and reached back to Lucy Maud Montgomery. Many of you would know her as a novelist, the author of the Anne of Green Gables series, which is dear to many of us, but not many people know her poetry. She wrote a great deal of poetry, a lot of it quite dark and brooding and romantic, but it lent itself well for this thick texture of solo cello and choir. I guess Tennyson has come up quite a bit in my writing. Peace Come Away for Saskatoon and Ring Out Wild Bells for Menno Singers, also a commission in memory of a former choir member who passed away. But I'd like to land on Babel, a choral symphony, which was a large work. You have the score here. If after our talk, if you want to come up and look through some of these objects here, I have a bit of a museum here with some things that you can handle. So this is the full score of the piece Babel, and it is a long and complex poem. Can't really show it to you effectively, you'll have to come up and see it later. But it's a long poem which includes marginalia in different languages, poems in Latin, Greek, Spanish, Italian, German, that comments on the main poem. And the theme is the Tower of Babel, and reflects on the idea that we strive to make art, and it's often crushed down by forces beyond our control. And of course, the biblical story talks about the workers having their languages confounded so they could not understand each other. So here's a combination of many languages and the central idea of the artist being reconciled to what may be. So, did we expand our square? I guess we need our square to now become a pentagon, right? So we've got musicians, influences, performers, listeners, and poets and librettists, text people. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, the question is, these texts are texts that you have always chosen as the composer, or have they sometimes been offered or imposed?
That's an excellent question. So sometimes I am approached to write something and someone has a poem that they're quite passionate about that they would like set. Or sometimes they say, I would like a piece, will you please find the poetry? And in the case of many of those pieces, those are classic pieces of poetry that are in public domain that are easily accessed. In this case, the poem was newly written, and I think I mentioned the poet's my sister. So that is really more of a collaboration where you really need the pentagon, because the poet is alive and maybe pushing back at some of your ideas. So it is a really important part of the geometry of creation in that case. Thank you for that question. I think a corner of our geometric shape needs to also include patrons. Composers and musicians need patrons, and for me, that is entirely how I work. I only write by commission, And most recently, I wrote a mass and a motet for this Roman Catholic church in San Francisco. It has not been performed yet, so I can't share the score with you, but I think it's really cool that they are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the creation of the parish, and they decided to commission music to honor that, which is great because music has this great power to bring people together and celebrate something. And it's also something that lasts for a long time. Another example of a commission is the piece Ascension on a text by John Donne. And I mention that because at the cathedral in Albuquerque, they do have an organization that is called Friends of Cathedral Music, and they commission a new piece every year. It is Dr. David and Anne Stinthcombe who sponsor this. So there's a new work every year, that's nice, you know. But let's think about the 18th century when Bach wrote a new cantata every week. Wouldn't that be better? So it's just joking, Maxine, if you're joining in online. It was a fantastic commission, and I went down and had a week in residence there and heard it performed. Another very important patron would be Ruben Valenzuela, who has visited here many times because he is passionate about Hilly Willen and is doing a lot of research on Willen. And we got to be friends in that way, and he also commissioned a big work, the Requiem for All Souls, which sets the ordinary and the propers for the Requiem Mass all in Latin. And that we are going to demonstrate to you. So I'd ask the singers to come back up again. And what we're going to do is just sing one movement of this piece. We'd be here for a very long time if we performed the whole Requiem. But the second movement is manageable for us for this small group. And on your handout, if you flip over to the second page, I've actually written out something for you to sing because I think this is quite manageable, and I have my eyes out there. I see there are many accomplished musicians in the audience today, so this will be lovely. And for those of you who say, I don't read music, I'll just unlock that right now. It's an easy thing because what you have here is a graph. Right, Janet? It's a graph. Absolutely. Yeah, and the graph shows you time, and it shows you the direction of the notes, and all you have to do is follow up and down. That's all it is. So reading music isn't too hard. But hey, choir, let's just demonstrate that line, just that one line for them. So we'll sing it when we sing the Requiem. We repeat it, and you can join in on the repeat. So the tune goes like pitch pipe, I guess. Tune goes like this. Thank you. Do you want to try that once? I'll to this fine, fine singing group that one of the magical things about tonight will be that you're going to see music being made in action, because this is not a polished performance. So I actually gave you the wrong note, and we'll begin again in the correct key. Thank you so much for joining in. Yeah. All right. So where were we? At a pentagon by this time? I want to add another side. 6 shapes, because I would think if I asked the musicians and composers in the audience what the essential element for making music is, I would say it's time. And another geometric shape. How nice is that? To show the proportion of time you need to spend in practice and the percentage that you actually present to living people who listen. So in the practice time for a composer, there's the actual writing of the music, yes, but there is also, in choral music, the finding of the perfect text and sitting with the text and understanding how that's going to be written. So it's kind of unstructured time. It's like you're not doing anything, but you're thinking about the poem and the images that it's creating in your mind and how that's going to be expressed musically. So we have a 7-shaped thingy now, don't we? I think so. All right. All right. I just want to consider how composers can address equity, diversity, historical missions, and environmental concerns. Just a small issue to talk about. Because this is, I think, something all artists want to deal with now, is just expanding our horizons from our own very narrow colonial upbringing to see the world in a bit bigger scope. And some people who have commissioned me have helped me along that road. Jeff Jodry, who conducted the Halifax Chamber Choir, he just recently retired, brought this beautiful text by the 12th century Jewish philosopher Solomon ibn Gabirol. So that is a piece that opened up a layer of research for me in that area. When Jason Abel from the historic Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, approached me to write a piece to dedicate the new organ in that church, he did. I keep wrestling with that thing. Sorry, I will stop doing that. The new organ, yes, I'll just underline that, new organ in his church, in the historic Church of Christ Church, Alexandria. He did not have a text in mind. So I was looking for something that might highlight a Black poet. The timing of this commission was in 2020, after some really horrible events. George Floyd had been murdered, and I think all artists wanted to do something about that. So I cast about looking for a text. And I came across this poet named Phyllis Wheatley. I don't know if any of you have encountered her poetry before. If you're American, you probably have, but in Canada, we didn't really study her in school. She is an 18th century poet, born in Africa and brought as a slave to America, educated by her family in Greek and Latin, and she writes poetry along the lines of Pope or Milton. It's very elevated, a lot of depictions of nature. It's absolutely beautiful poetry. And as it happens, in that church, Christ Church, Alexandria, Virginia, was the church where George Washington attended service. And in fact, George Washington and Phyllis Wheatley met. They had dinner together, and she wrote a poem for him. So just like how strange that worlds can collide like that. So I've set two of her poems. One is for the Association of Anglican Musicians. They have a conference coming up in June, so they asked me to write a piece, and I chose another one of her poems because they're so lovely and inspiring, and they fit well with choral music, with the meter and rhyme scheme. And that brings us to Landovery Castle, which is an opera. This is the full score and the choral score if you want to look at it. And I hope I don't embarrass Nate Hendley by introducing him. Nate is a very accomplished writer, especially of Canadian history, and he's about to write a book about Landovery Castle. So I invited him to come today. I'm just delighted to see you here because you're curious about the opera, of course. I think it needs maybe a little background for people who have not heard of Landovery Castle. Landovery Castle was a Canadian hospital ship in the First World War. It carried wounded soldiers back to Canada from Liverpool to Halifax, and then the ship without any wounded came back to Liverpool to do the trip over and over again. And on this particular voyage in 2018, There were 14 nurses aboard the ship. They were given this assignment as a kind of respite if they were nurses who had really been burned out and were having problems, struggling with the horrors they'd seen on the front. They were given this assignment just to calm down a little bit, to accompany the wounded back to Canada and maybe see their family in Halifax and come back again. But unfortunately, the hospital ship was torpedoed by a German submarine in June 2018. And, sorry, I think I'm looking at 2018 there. 1918, thank you. Yes, 2018 was the 100th anniversary of that event, and that's why we were motivated to present the opera on that anniversary. Thank you. Nate's going to ask me why I wanted to write that opera. And you know, it comes down to a historical plaque. And when I entered the church today, my interest was heightened to see the plaques that are here in memory of people who have died. In Calvin Presbyterian Church, there's a plaque to one of these nurses, and I read that, and it was kind of ironic because I was music director at Calvin for 11 years, and I never once looked at that plaque. But when I was visiting, I had a little time and realized there's this plaque to a woman who was a member of the church who died on a hospital ship in 1918. And the ship was named Landovery Castle. But that is a story that I never heard growing up. And I think Nate really wonders, that's kind of a central question of your book. So why didn't we learn about that? I mean, writing an opera about a subject might not get it into the history books. Nate, I don't know, but writing an opera brings people together for an event, and it starts people talking about things. And I also want to acknowledge Jennifer Collins, who is here tonight, who was essentially the producer of this opera in the workshop revival, the workshop as we worked through and created the piece. So part of the research there should be a whole stack of books here, but that is part of the creation of the opera, is reading every book possible on the nurses themselves. And also, because the opera involved real people, it's not a fictional account. They have relatives, and although all those nursing sisters have no offspring, because if you were a nurse in the army in those days, you couldn't get married. You just had to do your job. So there are no children of those nurses, but there are nieces, grandnieces, and grandnephews. So part of the research for the opera was traveling out to Prince Edward Island to meet the family of Rena McLean and see the site where her hospital was built in Charlottetown. So building a relationship with those people, we tried to connect with the families of all 14 nurses, which was not possible in the time frame, but subsequently I have met many of them. And this is Jennifer's brilliant idea, one of the objects here in our display, which you might like to look at, is this little ribbon which was made to signify that you were a family member. So people who came to that workshop, they wore this, and we were able to identify people who were relatives of the 14 nurses, or the other members of the crew as well were there. And the McLean clan were very kind to me. They kind of made me an unofficial McLean. And they gave me this historic little pin too, which is the nurse's pin. So, although we cannot perform the entire opera this evening, we want to excerpt one thing that can be done with a small group who has no rehearsal time. So, singers, will you come up? So we do need your help on this one because there is a chorus in the opera. The scene in the opera takes place on deck on a Sunday morning when all of the nurses would participate in a service of worship. And the 14 nurses came from all across Canada. They were of every religious denomination, Roman Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian. So this is an imaginary scenario when all of the nurses can sing a piece of music from their own tradition. And this is just a happy coincidence that they all fit together at the same time. So could we, maybe I'll take a survey. Who here knows the tune Amazing Grace? Very good. And who knows this hymn, Ave Maria? Yeah, you know that too. So you seem to know the Ave Maria tune over here a little bit more, and maybe Amazing Grace over here. So we'll call you Choir 1. So you folks are going to sing Amazing Grace, but you're going to sing this verse that I've written out here. And you'll be choir 2, so you'll sing Ave Maria. So we need to rehearse, right? This is the 90% of the rehearsal? Yeah, okay. So choir 1, who has Amazing Grace? Sorry? Was that a question? No, okay. We're going to rehearse that. That's where we'll sing it. So these guys will help you. It's choir 1. Are you going to sing? Thumbs up? All right, here we go. Thank you so much. Choir 2, this Ave Maria is actually, it's sliced in half and has the B section on top. So it's a bit rearranged, but you'll catch on. These guys will lead you in Ave Maria, choir 2. Thank you. All right, so those 2 tunes from totally different traditions, you'd never know it, but they go together. And on top of that, we're going to elaborate a little bit. We'll add a few more tunes. So sopranos, let's just demonstrate what you're going to sing on top. So that text comes from a Methodist hymn book that I happened to pull off my shelf when I was looking for content for this piece. And the tune is newly composed to fit with the others, but the text is from the Methodist hymnal. And gentlemen, do you want to demonstrate what you will sing? You are going to represent the French nurse and sing in French. Sorry. Lovely. All right. Do we dare put it all together? Okay, so we will do this performance style now. I'll play along. We'll start with the soprano tune. They'll be number 1. They'll keep going, and we'll add choir 1. Then we'll add choir 2, so you keep singing. So we're adding it up, we're layering it up. And then finally, the gentleman can come in. And it should all work out. Let's see what happens. Thank you so much for making that happen. It takes a little bit of courage to hang on to your tune when everything is going in the opposite direction. Very nicely done. Okay. Okay, recap on our geometric shape. Where are we? An octagon? Heptagram? All right. Yeah, so the last piece I want to talk about is the current piece that I'm working on, which is not here because it doesn't exist yet. Sort of in this area over here. with some of the research books stacked up here. So, I mean, this goes along with the idea, I mean, can a piece of music change the world? I do not think so, but it can raise awareness and bring people together. So this big project with the Grand Philharmonic Choir and the KW Symphony in Kitchener is an oratorio. So it's written for the adult choir, the youth choir, the children's choir, full orchestra, and 4 soloists who are soprano, alto, tenor, bass. The soprano, the role is water. She's a coloratura soprano. The alto is the mayor of a fictional town in northern Ontario. Her son, the tenor, is an environmental activist, and the baritone is the developer who wants to typecast a little bit, but this is the classical legacy of voices that we have. And the dramatic problem is that the developer wants to build a factory on an aquifer, which is the purest water in the world, literally. So the background for this is a collaborative piece. So the text is being created, so yeah, there needs to be another corner to the shape. And at this point in the lecture, a student raises their hand and says, why don't we just make it a circle? Because the corners are getting very soggy, so let's just open it up. And actually, a circle is a really good geometric shape for this whole process, because a lot of us travel back and forth between the different areas. Working with my librettist, creating the text for this piece, we realized that we needed to have Indigenous collaboration. And that has led me on to places that I did not expect. And I have put this here, this object, to remind me of a student who is a composition student at York. She's just graduated. She speaks Cree. She's from a reserve north of Edmonton. And she was just nominated for a Juno Award. Yes, her major research paper at York was turned into a recording, and that it was nominated for a Juno. But that is another element to our circle, is I think our students, because they teach us more than we know. The other books here that you can look at if you come up here are sort of inspirations. The Sacred Balance by David Suzuki was an inspiration for this piece. Because amidst his text about the environment, he also brings in ancient quotations from philosophers, Hildegard of Bingen, and people who talked about the environment a long, long time ago. It's a really interesting combination. And other books here which you might want to look at. Yeah, the oratorio premieres at the end of May, so I hope you'll all make the journey up to Kitchener-Waterloo to see it. I won't say more about that because our time is running short, but I'll just introduce the last piece that we're going to sing, and I think you guys can come up here. That is from a collection of choral pieces based on poetry by Robert Frost. Again, a collaborator here was the Elora Singers. This was written for them during COVID, and it's an interesting example of how something good can come out of hardship, because since we couldn't have an audience, we needed to make a video of this piece, and now we have that forever to look at, and they did a beautiful job of recording it. The piece that we're going to sing for you is the first piece in that sequence. It's called Nothing Gold Can Stay.
First green is gold.
Thank you. Thank you to each and every one of you singers who have taken this evening to demonstrate some of those pieces. I think our time is officially up, Larry, so I would invite you to come up and engage with some of this material and chat a bit. And thank you so much for coming.